Good morning, all. It's 8:01. I'm behind a minute. It's great to see you all this morning at the intersection. My grandchildren have even they pace their lives by my Thursday morning. Because I was doing at the intersection, of course, during COVID, because that's when it started. But I moved in with them at that same time. And so on Thursday mornings, they knew that I needed to be in this spot. So I was with my granddaughter, who's 12, last night, and she said, "Hey, tomorrow's Thursday. Do you still have that crazy meeting?" And I'm like, "Yep." And so it's really funny that a 12-year-old and a 6-year-old know my Thursday morning schedule. And they're concerned about it. It's really priority, so they got that message. Bless their hearts. Announcements. Let's take about 2 to 3 minutes of announcements before we begin. Doug, did you want to say anything about Pathways to Hope? Some highlights?
Yeah, pathwaystohope.net. Registration's open. You can go to the NAMI website or the Pathways website. August 25th and 26th is free. Let me tell you about just real quickly, a few of the workshops. Navigating the court system with Judge Huff, access to under-resourced communities, particularly on the west and south sides. We're going to have we'll have Raul Andrews from the American Psychiatric Association talk about how corporations and businesses can become involved in community mental health. Ann is leading a panel on housing. Mary Beth Fisk will be bringing a panel from Uvalde and much, much more. It's all on the website. And it's don't miss. You need to be there, but you also need to take a friend. So that's my quick announcement on Pathways.
So the last time you looked, Doug, this is to build excitement, right? The last time you looked, how many people were registered for Pathways to Hope?
As of yesterday afternoon, around 500.
500. So
we want another 500, and we've had that almost every year. But it's one of the best things about it is you get to be there with a lot of other people who are interested in the same things you are. They're also they have mental health issues in some cases, but it's a great community gathering.
Great. I'm looking for 2 more 500s, by the way. 2 more 500s. Are there any other announcements that people want to share? I want to make sure that everyone, I know it's months away, but that you note on your calendar the Tuesday of Thanksgiving week. I believe it's November 21. It's going to be a citywide food donation gathering on Main Plaza, giving thanks from many faiths within San Fernando Cathedral. It's been happening for about, 30 years, but there's a lot of partnerships going into it, the food bank, the cathedral, the historic society. So I just think it's going to be really exciting, and it's always been historically my favorite gathering in San Antonio. But so mark your calendars. I would love to see you there Thanksgiving week. Any other announcements?
And this is Mignon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Mignon.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to just announce that Antioch is having their annual back to school giveaway this Saturday at the church. We're going to start at 10 a.m. We historically try to give out 300 backpacks as well as Walmart gift cards to the parents to kind of help with some of the back to school expenses. So please ship, and I'll send a flyer to you when I get to the office. But please invite anyone that you know, a family in the community that might need school supplies, as well as a little extra cash. And it'll be this Saturday at 10 a.m. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and send that, Mignon. I think there's also a similar one at Christ Episcopal with Justin Lindstrom. I think they're also doing a large one. We could probably use, like 50 of those around the community, right? And that wouldn't hurt at all. It certainly would help. It's 8:06 and I'm going to hand this off to Doug and Ernie. Any other announcements that folks may have, please put those in the chat. And you might even want to do that a couple times if you see that other people are coming in later. I've noticed that chat doesn't, when you come in later, you miss the early chats. They don't show themselves. They only show after you get there. So anyway, Doug, many of you know, is with NAMI and Bridges to Care and Pathways to Hope. And many of you may not know this, but he volunteers in all of that. So just so you know, a really strong community volunteer. And he's brought a colleague friend with him, Ernie Stevens. And he's famous. And I'm going to let Doug introduce famous Ernie. And if you recall the shooting, and I put that in the e-notification yesterday, but it happened not that long ago. And there was concern at the intersection about what happened there and how it was handled. And people stepped up at the intersection and said, we got to do something different. And so I know that Doug and others have been working on that something different. So I'm going to hand it over to Doug and to Ernie and tell us all about it, man.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to screen share here if I can navigate my way. Okay, hang on. There we go. Let me try it now. Okay, screen share. I'm looking for my PowerPoint. Here we go. Can you see it now?
We can.
Okay. So I want to preface this by starting out saying, when you have a family member with a mental health issue, or you have a mental health issue, in the past, typically we could call the police department, ask for help, and ask for a mental health officer. And the mental health unit, of which Ernie was a part at one time and has he can tell you about the history, they would send a mental health officer out. And these are specially trained people who are psychologically screened for the unit. And I will tell you that almost without exception, including in my case, when we had a mental health unit officer come out, it was great. The way they handled the situation, de-escalated it, found help for the family, found help for the individual who was in crisis, was exactly the way we wanted to do things. So let me go to, I'm going to advance this slide or try. So what really happened in this case? Well, we know that Melissa Perez, we all heard that she was shot to death. Most of us saw the video. It was more than alarming. I think everybody from the police chief on down and throughout the community knew that the way it was handled was not the best way. And certainly, you know, Melissa Perez died, but it wasn't the way that the police department have handled these calls in the past. So in my investigation, kind of in following up on that, one of the things that I read about that has changed from some years ago is the fact that when you call 911 and ask for help and say, I have a family member with a mental health issue and they're not a danger to themselves, they're not a danger to the community, but they need some help. Can you send a mental health unit? And what has happened is the procedure has changed so that the first response is from a patrol unit, officers in the field. And then if they decide that there's a mental health issue that needs the mental health unit, then they call the mental health unit. But the problem is, in talking to NAMI families, is they hardly ever see that mental health unit, or it comes a day, 2 days, 3 days later. And it's not the same. And I'll describe that in just a moment. So what we're seeing at NAMI now is through our warm line is immediately after the calls, after the shooting, our members and the community are afraid to call the police department. I mean, that's really a problem in our community when the community is afraid to call the police department because of what may happen. So what I did was I called up Ernie, and I'm going to let him talk in just a second. But my question was, well, what do other communities do? And so, Ernie, I'm going to ask you if you will talk through maybe what Denver and the LAPD do, how they handle mental health calls today.
Certainly, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to join the conversation this morning. And just for context, I did retire from the San Antonio Police Department after 27 years in January of 2021. Prior to that, I was a police officer in Terrell Hills, so right at 30 years of total law enforcement. I attended my first mental health training in 2003 when the Houston Police Department came, and I was so overtaken by the information that was provided and how, I'll say what it is. I'm very transparent, how ignorant I was to what mental health truly was and how it presented. I was fascinated and really wanted to take that training on here for San Antonio. I just needed to tweak the material to meet the resources here locally. So after numerous discussions with the chief's office, I was allowed to be one of the lead instructors for the crisis intervention training. And then in 2008, I was a board member for NAMI. Just so happens that at a legislative meeting when Chief McManus was present, Ed Dickey, who was the president at the time of NAMI, asked if we could get a mental health unit started in San Antonio. Kind of caught me off guard because I was sitting next to the chief. I thought he's going to think I was up to this. But we did. We started a mental health unit in 2008 with 2 officers. I was paired with 1 other officer. And really, we had not defined what this unit was going to look like. No policy, no procedure was put in place yet. So we kind of had to build that out. So when we built it out, the goal was, 1, to relieve the amount of officers that were going to the hospitals to write the involuntary commitments. Because when a patient presents at a hospital that they feel needs to be held involuntarily for a psychological examination, police have to go and respond to that. Doctors cannot write the hold. Clinicians cannot write the hold. At the federal level, we're looking at some legislative strategies to get that changed. But currently, that's how things are done here in Texas. We also were going to respond to calls that patrol was dispatched to relieve them and get them back in service. And then in between calls, if we weren't tied up on something, we would take active 911 calls off the screens and respond to those ourselves. And then as we grew, we kind of kept that status quo where we could pick calls up off the screen, just let the dispatcher of whatever area of town know that we would be responding to that call. And if we thought we needed patrol to assist us, we could request that. So there was a time when the police department's mental health unit could and did respond to active 911 calls. I did thousands of them, so I know how it worked. Over time, some things have changed, and the unit itself has really been stretched in many different directions. You have several officers on the team assigned to a threat assessment with the fusion department or the fusion center. You've got some officers working the San Antonio core unit, which we'll talk about here in a moment. And then you've got some other officers that are assigned to the program for intensive care and coordination program, which is also a pre-crisis intervention to try to reduce high utilizers from calling 911 or to putting stress on the acute healthcare system. So in context, I wanted you to know kind of what's happening here locally and why it's so difficult probably to get a mental health officer to respond. So Doug did reach out. I say, what are other communities doing? So now I work for the Council of State Governments Justice Center, which is a national organization. We are the technical assistance advisors, subcontractors for the Department of Justice. So any police agency that gets federal dollars to set up any kind of these programs that we're talking about here today, we have the contract to provide the training and assistance for them so they can get their federal dollars. So I oversee the law enforcement portfolio nationally for this. When Doug reached out, he asked what other communities are doing, and there's many communities that are moving towards or adding a community responder program. In Denver, they're probably the ones on the cutting edge the most between them and Los Angeles PD. Denver Star program is a community responder team. And I went out to Denver to actually look at this program, the statistics, and how they sustain this program. The Denver Star program is made up of a emergency medical technician, basic EMT, not a paramedic. So they can do very basic medical triage, blood pressure, temperature, things like that, basic first aid. And then they also have either a social worker or a mental health professional, sometimes a bachelor level care clinician that can go out and help do assessments. The calls that this team responds to are really low level social determinants of health calls. So if you've got somebody that may be intoxicated or having a low level mental health crisis, maybe they're depressed, having thoughts of suicide, calls for unhoused individuals in certain areas of town, just minor disturbances, through a call triage, through the dispatch center, the call taker who receives the call will begin to triage that call to determine, do we need a police response, a fire response, a medical response, or we've got a co-responder team like the San Antonio Corps, which is made up of a police officer and a clinician, or do we send the Denver Star program? The Denver Star, again, is just a basic EMT with a mental health professional. So as you see here on this slide, they've responded to over 30,000 low-level calls for assistance. Never been involved in a shooting or a use of force or a death. And they've had 0 arrests out of 30,000 calls, and only a handful of those resulted in where they needed to request police just to stand by because the call had a potential of maybe turning violent based on behaviors or the acuity of the patient. So when you look at this type of response, you have removed law enforcement completely out of the response. Now, is that appropriate for every call? Absolutely not. Will you be able to remove law enforcement from mental health calls? Absolutely not. But this also gives you an option of sending a different level of care to a patient that does not need a police response. You have to remember, not everybody that calls 911 needs a police officer. They're just out of options. Thank goodness we have 988 now. It's just trying to get the word out of what 988 is and when it's appropriate to call. If you look at LAPD, they also have a co-responder model that goes out with patrol. Their team is called the SMART team. Coincidentally, Bexar County has an identical unit called the SMART team, which pairs a deputy, a paramedic, and a master's social worker together. And they respond to the unincorporated parts of Bexar County, in addition to the over 30 municipalities that lay within Bexar County. So these are alternative responses that community members have been asking for to limit police response to mental health calls. These are fantastic models. Like I said, at the national level, you're seeing more and more of these begin to be formed. Oregon really started the first one back in the 80s, known as the CAHOOTS program, spelled CAHOOTS. And they did the mapping, they did the sequential intercept mapping. They started 0 and 1 on the sequential intercept model of where you would intercept somebody with a mental health diagnosis. And they've been responding to these calls. No clinicians ever been killed, no medics ever been injured. I think there's such a fear of what will happen if we put civilians to respond to these types of calls. But what you have to remember, folks, is that the mobile crisis outreach team, the MCOT team that is overseen and supervised by your local mental health authority here, the Center for Healthcare Services, has been responding to these types of calls, sending civilian clinicians into people's homes for over 20 years without anybody getting killed. Right? I think there's just this struggle to understand what's a good balance for this city. And a city this size could easily be able to implement a co-responder team to work with a community responder team, a co-responder team, have your mental health team available as well. So it's just having the options available to meet the needs of your community.
Thank you, Ernie. So, and let me just emphasize, I think one other point is when a mental health unit officer and this co-responder type unit comes out, or a SMART team from the county, they're well trained, and the response that we get, that families get, is great. What I get as feedback is when a regular patrol unit comes out, unfortunately, the response is often dismissive and abusive. Not in all cases, but these are people that, you know, while they've had 40 hours of CIP training, crisis training, and they get an 8-hour refresher every 3 years, it's also not the same type of officer. It's not the same type of personality. So there is a difference. And I think we will be doing a survey through NAMI of our members, asking them to report to us issues that they have when they make when they call for mental health assistance. I think that there's a lot more problems with these calls than gets reported in the press. In fact, I know there are. We get those calls all the time. It's so what we're recommending is that San Antonio adopt this community responder unit. Ernie mentioned SA Core, which was a multidisciplinary program that SAPD piloted, and there's one unit out of the central substation. There's the budget proposal this year, I think, has another 2 units proposed for the city of San Antonio. That would be 3 SA Core multidisciplinary response units. That's great, but that's not enough. And they also need to be deployed in a way in which that's the first response as opposed to the last response. So the other thing that I learned from talking to Denver, for example, is that they staff these multidisciplinary units from not just their police department, but from their fire department, from their public safety, from their parks unit. So there are other departments that can also help carry the load. So what we've talked about is consider placing 2 CRUs in each of the 6 SAPD police substations, backed up by the SA Core units. I think the other thing is that we need a mental health professional on the 911 dispatch calls. Ernie talked about 988. 988 is a new national system. It's being implemented, but it's not fully implemented at this point. Bexar County does not have its own 988 call center. Those calls go to Austin, which then routes them to San Antonio. You know, that doesn't sound like a great solution. So I think where we are today, and I'll stop sharing, is that I wanted to let people, let me see if I can do that. And okay, so we're not sharing anymore. So I want people to know about other alternatives and the fact that the system that we have right now is really not working that well. And yet, as Ernie can tell you, if we go about this in a different way, have a different model, we'll place less demand on the police department today, which already has a manpower problem. So this is a win-win. It's a win for the community. It's a win for the police department and the city budget. And it's a win for the families who have to make these difficult calls. And I am, it upsets me a lot when a family calls for help and what they end up getting is not very good treatment. So that's what I wanted to present today, Ann, and I need for more people to know about the alternatives. We're going to be trying to talk to both city council people and people at the police department. and the community. Only the community is going to be able to, I think, drive us to a better solution. People have to demand better care. So let me open it up to any questions for either Ernie or myself.
Well, before we go to that, because it's 8:26. So we're gonna take a pause for those who might have to leave, but and you've kind of answered the big major, I think, question, is then how do we talk to the system and get this to move? And so what I hear you saying, it's going to take the community to talk to the system and to get it to move. I'm wondering, though, if it would be helpful, because he loves to come, but if we invited the chief to come to the intersection and discuss this, that the community is looking at this, et cetera, et cetera. But we could do that. I'm wondering what the strategy is, Doug, of talking to city council. Are there specifics to those strategies?
Yeah, so I've already been reaching out to city council members, and Councilwoman Melissa, is it Melissa Havarda? Is the head of public safety, and she runs a public safety committee. So I think, first of all, we need to get our council people aware and on board. I think it'd be fine to ask the chief or Deputy Chief Karen Fawkes, who is over all of the mental health programs. But I don't think, I think that this is going to take the community's voice and to be able to make this change.
Right.
Because we had a better system at one point, and it migrated off to something that really isn't serving us well. So I think the Public Safety Committee, and there are 5 members on there, and I think any one of those could come, but I think Councilwoman Havarda would be where we need to start.
Yeah, and I think we can do that at the intersection. That'll help us to start to exercise that voice. And it'll help everyone who's listening in to learn still more about how to use their voice and where to go with that. So I'll kind of do that. It's 8:28. I see your hand, Peter. It's 8:28, and I want to thank all who've been here this morning for being here, and anyone who needs to leave, because we do want to respect everyone's busy lives. And so thank you for being here today. I'm going to work on trying to bring Melissa or somebody into this conversation and see what that produces. The plan for next week is that we're going to be looking at the city budget. It's that time of year, and our voices also make a difference in terms of city budget. And so there are town halls for that are coming into all the districts, and maybe you got something at your door, I'm not sure, but we always try to bring somebody, and it's usually Maria Villa-Gomez who comes and explains, what's the movement in the budget and what it comes down to. So that's the hope for next week. So let's turn to the other questions. Peter, then Arthur.
Thank you, Ann. And Doug, thank you so much for taking this initiative on. Great presentation, Ernie, and thank you for your service. That correlation, and we launched our Bridges to Care program earlier this year, and when we launched it in collaboration with the Southwest Texas Fusion Center, and trying to make that correlation between how the Bridges to Care mental wellness program can mitigate the violent crime and response with and indirectly benefiting law enforcement and bringing that awareness. And in the short time that we've had our program, I've had those experiences, Doug, already with families that have had to make those calls, and so I can also confirm that frustration. And so I think it's a great idea of the co-responder, that Denver plan with the EMT and the clinician. And so Ernie, my question, and you mentioned the funding that's available, is there anything related currently that's available that the city could kind of plug and play where they could seek that grant funding? And of course, I know the budget is currently being reviewed now for this year. How far are we on being able to really, I know we have to create the support for the program, but how soon can we get something funded?
Thank you, Peter. The Bureau of Justice Assistance will release solicitations for applications for funding in January. So it's a little ways off, but this gives you time to start to prepare and plan, right? Those applications usually run January through May, and they can go as high as up to $750,000 for grant funding to help create these types of programs or initiatives. And what you have to keep in mind is this is a much cheaper approach at trying to build an alternative response. When you have to, let's look at San Antonio Core, right? You have a police officer with all their full benefits that you have to pay. You've got a full paramedic with San Antonio Fire, right? So the paramedic on there can push drugs, can start an IV, can do very high level emergency care out in the scene, which if you look at both Core and SMART here locally, how many times have they actually had to do that? And it was very, very rare that either one of them had to provide that level of care. Normally, if a patient needed a higher level of care, they would call for an EMS unit to transport the patient. So just to give you an idea, now you've got an EMT basic level, which is a lot cheaper than a paramedic, and a bachelor's level care clinician, because all you really need that clinician to do is one, be able to de-escalate the situation and make that referral for an intake or link to services based on what you have available. And that's a lot cheaper than trying to find a licensed professional counselor or a master social worker, which are in high demand right now. And that's the hardest part to try to staff, is that position, because nationally we're about 8,000 social workers in the whole trying to staff these programs. So if you can lower, and I'm not saying your standard, but if you can lower the licensing type of individuals that you're going to start this team with, you look at the van that I would recommend go out to Denver. I can fund somebody from, usually it's the police department and the local mental health authority to go out and look at the program. But really the only thing you need from the police department to buy into this program is their ability to triage the call and dispatch that team, because you're not in the need of law enforcement to respond. So it's not going to be a manpower issue. It's going to be a triage issue as the call comes into 911. And you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I've got plenty of triage schematics to show you on how these calls are triaged in order to send these particular teams. So grant funding is out there. You could also look at, I know when San Antonio PD outfitted and worked collaboratively with the Center for Healthcare Services to start the program for intensive care coordination, and that's the response to the 100 highest utilizers in San Antonio for psych services. They were able to use private funding from the hospitals, because if you engage the crisis before it happens to find out where's the gap in service for this patient, why do they keep coming in, you can reduce that front door traffic, right? Or reduce arrests or hospitalizations. So private funders came in to fund this. And then last year, Doug was there, Capital Health, help me out, Doug, who's the ones that did the evaluation of the program?
Capital Health Planning or
Capital Health Planning. Actually, it's a third-party evaluator came in and audited that program. And that $1.6 million investment for the program for intensive care that the private funders paid for saved the city $4 million and reduced involuntary commitments and arrests. So, I mean, the sustainability is there when you look at the numbers, and these programs are a lot cheaper to build out than what San Antonio Core or Bexar County Smart Team looks like.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Good deal.
Arthur. Or did he take his hand down?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I think you're on the right track. I think having done clinical social work for 40 years, I think you're on the right track of getting all these elements together. Keep in mind the collaborative that Erica Stevenson with the health department is working on too. She's well connected with some of these issues and institutions. I think it's just a matter of time. And I think you're organizing this towards effectiveness in itself will be a major contribution. just getting this formula together and this organizing plan is something that is really, really the basis of this. I wanted to share also that I entered into the chat. It says commemoration of the bombings. It's not the bombings of Pax Christi, but it's a commemoration by Pax Christi of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And as many of you have seen the film Oppenheimer and know that some people are actually seeing nuclear use as an option. And Kennedy and Reagan did say there are no options. There cannot be a nuclear war. You may not agree with everything she says in this, but I will stimulate your thinking. And so I highly recommend you take a look at this video. Thank you.
Thanks, Arthur. And it also reminds me, and I'd like to invite us to take a minute, for deaths that just do not have to happen, in the unnecessary ways, right? But with Melissa and all the way to nuclear weapons. And so I want to take just a minute. Throughout history, current day, there are much better ways to be human to each other. Bill, your hand is up.
There were two questions in the chat that I thought I would pose to Doug and Ernie.
Thanks.
One was who in San Antonio and Bexar County has the authority to implement these changes that you're recommending? And the second one is a related question, which is asking, is charter reform an appropriate vehicle for this work?
Well, I think that in this case, and Ernie has a lot of background here too, it's our local city government. I mean, if the council wants and the mayor want a different type of response, they can direct the police department. And that's how we got some of the programs started. I want to make it clear that I support the work that the police department does. I think it's a hard job. I think, and unfortunately, the patrol units are carrying a big part of this. They don't necessarily, this is a hard job. So let's put the right people with the right training on these responses. But I think it's going to have to start with the council because I think it's going to take that kind of public support for the police department to feel comfortable that they can implement a solution that does not involve a police officer on the scene. So that's my quick answer. I think charter reform, it's kind of like changing the Constitution. It's a long process. I don't think I wouldn't go in that direction personally. Ernie, do you have anything? You work with governments across the.
Yeah, no. I mean, when the SMART team in Bexar County was formed, it went through county commissioners. They were, thinking, how are we going to fund this? Are we going to use ARPA dollars, grant funding? The SMART team in Bexar County did apply for the Connect and Protect grant through the Bureau of Justice Assistance and was awarded that. My team actually oversees that grant right now, and they're in the planning phase of that grant, which I think they'll fly through pretty quickly because they're really up and running and have been doing this for several years. So the implementation funds, I think, will follow pretty quickly. When it comes to the city, it's the same thing. It's going to be, city council, your city manager. They looked at the Meadows report and thought, okay, we need to go ahead and do this co-responder team, build it out almost identical to Bexar County SMART team, and get that up and running. And that was the same thing. How are we going to fund this? I believe they put a line item budget in there to fund that. STRAC, your Southwest Texas Regional Advisory Council, oversees both those programs as far as the data and reporting out collection. They buy all the equipment to outfit. They buy the vehicles, they outfit the vehicles, they buy the heart monitors. They're a huge partner. Like nobody can, the days of being siloed are over. Like the size of this city, this should already have been happening. I'm going to be honest with you. You're the 7th largest city. Why in the world do you not have more options available? Right. And I'm not saying that selfishly. I responded. I was out there. I know how difficult it can be and stressful on the police department because you want to try to get to every single call and you just cannot as the mental health unit. There are just too many calls to get to. And you try to teach patrol at these in-service trainings, look, utilize us when you think this call is going to exceed your ability to handle this call in an appropriate manner or in a sufficient amount of time. We didn't want to be utilized to go to the hospitals just to fill out a form. Patrol can do that and do it very quickly. We wanted to respond to calls like what we discussed earlier, with the tragedy that happened, hopefully for a different outcome. The training that San Antonio gets at one time was considered a gold standard. They teach 40 hours of crisis intervention training. They teach 40 hours of de-escalation training because of the Sandra Bland Act, and they do an 8-hour refresher quarterly because of state standards here. So it's not a lack of training. It truly isn't. It's a lack of critical thinking and reasoning by the officers that are responding. And a lot of these skills are diminishing skills that you will lose over time if you don't stay up current. And if you don't stay current, you don't understand what all resources you have available to you. But the social workers and the mental health professionals do. They know because that is their daily, that is their job, is to know what's available to the public to link for services. So to have an officer always respond to a mental health call, it's like sending a plumber to change a light bulb. It just, a lot of times it just doesn't make sense. You've got to send the right people to get the right outcome. So this is a big enough city to implement these types of programs. The funding is going to be minimal compared to what you see money being spent on in the budget. How many $1 billion now is your city budget up to? I mean, it's not going to be that difficult to at least start with 2 or 3 of these types of units spread out systematically throughout the city to start looking at some data and outcomes. So my department, the Justice Center, would love to be a technical assistance advisor to any grants that you receive through the Bureau of Justice. And we'll just keep pushing forward and hope for change.
Mary, is your question long or short? We're at 8:43 and I close at 8:45.
Hopefully it's short.
Okay, go ahead and ask it.
I'm a person with lived experience of mental illness.
Hmm.
And I'm also a mental health peer specialist. And I believe some of those teams, I've heard of the one in Oregon and the Denver Star, or the one in Denver. And I believe they had peer specialists on their teams. Or I thought they did. And so were those included? Were mental health peer specialists included on the teams?
Yeah, Mary, great question. The SMART team of Bexar County does have a peer specialist assigned to the team. Their role kind of morphed over time. When they first started, we were actually using them to respond to some of the 911 calls with the officers. But then it morphed into more of a follow-up type role for them, where they could actually go to the hospital or the treatment facility to meet with the patient. Because as a police officer, I know where to take somebody. I know where the front door is. But a peer knows what treatment looks like and knows what's going to happen on the back side, on the back door of continuity of care and wraparound services. They are undervalued, they are underpaid, and they are underappreciated. And without peers attached to these teams, you're going to have a shortcoming, I think.
Thank
And
you
we're
for
going to
that.
stop there. Yeah, thanks, Mary. It's a great comment and question. We're going to stop there. It's 8:45. Great conversation, and not just great conversation, but some important movement that needs to be had in our city. The word conversation is a very interesting word, by the way. We think about it as talking, which it is, but it's a relational word, and it means with voice, with verse. And so even as we approach city council or making this movement, that is part of the conversation. That is how we get inverse together. And so we can't just talk about this. We need to move and put our whole body into the conversation. So have great weekends. It's hot. So make sure we all take care of ourselves and each other. And I will see you next week at the intersection. Watch for your notification. We might have some tweaks because of today's conversation. And please register today for Pathways to Hope. Thanks all.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you, Ernie.
You bet.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Ernie. Thank you, everybody.